Welcome to Order Before Modern Systems. Here, we explore how everyday order functioned before modern systems, institutions, and formal rules existed. This channel examines how routine, habit, and shared expectations shaped daily life long before modern organization took form. Order through visibility. This is the idea that simply being seen, or expecting to be seen, can shape behavior. Long before modern police departments, many societies relied on visibility to keep peace, prevent theft, and enforce rules. This was not only about guards watching people, it was also about neighbors watching neighbors, communities tracking reputation, officials using public space, and institutions using layout and routine so that people felt observed. In this documentary-style explanation, we will look at how visibility worked as a tool of order across historical periods. We will focus on systems tied to crime, justice, investigation, and punishment before modern law enforcement. The point is not that the past had no rules. The point is that the past often enforced rules through public watching, shared responsibility, and environments designed to make behavior easier to observe. To understand this, it helps to separate three related ideas. First is direct surveillance. This is when a person with authority watches people, like a guard, a watchman, a magistrate, or a patrol. Second is social visibility. This is when everyday life happens in settings where other people can see, recognize, and remember you, like a village street, a market, a church gathering, or a town meeting. Third is recorded visibility. This is when authorities keep lists, registers, reports, and written records that make behavior visible even when no one is physically present. These three kinds of visibility often work together. In many places, formal police forces were small or did not exist. So order depended on systems that made it hard to remain unknown. Visibility in small communities. In many historical settings, daily life was public by design. Homes were close together. Work happened outdoors or in open shops. People walked to common wells, ovens, mills, and markets. In a small village or neighborhood, strangers stood out. A person's movements were noticed. This created a basic form of control. If you expected to be recognized, you were less free to act without consequences. Not because someone would arrest you right away, but because your identity could be connected to what happened. Reputation mattered because it was a kind of long-term visibility. A person could be known as reliable, violent, dishonest, or quarrelsome. That reputation affected whether others would trade with them, testify for them, employ them, or support them in disputes. This did not mean crime was rare. It meant that many communities had systems where the first step in enforcement was not a professional investigator. The first step was recognition: who was seen, who was present, who was known, and who could be named. In such settings, a simple question often carried great force: who saw it? Another was, who can vouch for this person? Mutual responsibility and the visibility of membership. In medieval England, one major system connected visibility to order through group responsibility. This is often described through the tithing and frank pledge systems. The basic idea was that groups of households or men were organized into units where members shared responsibility for each other's behavior. If an accused person failed to appear when required, the group could face penalties. Membership mattered, and membership was made visible through local organization and periodic checks. This kind of system works best when people can identify who belongs and who does not. It pushes communities to notice newcomers and to keep track of their own members. It also pressures families and neighbors to intervene early, before a pattern of misconduct becomes a wider problem. Here, visibility is not only about watching an act, it is also about making social bonds visible: who is attached to whom, who is under whose responsibility, and who can be produced for questioning. When order depends on producing the suspect, it becomes important that people cannot easily vanish. A person's place in the community becomes a form of control. Hue and cry, turning the community into the pursuer. Another historical method that tied order to visibility was the hue and cry, connected to medieval common law and reinforced by later legal rules in England. This method treated the immediate aftermath of a crime as a public event. If a felony or robbery was witnessed, the witness or local officer was expected to raise an alarm. The alarm called others to assist in pursuit. The pursuit could pass from town to town. This is a striking example of order through visibility. A fleeing suspect is most vulnerable when the community is watching roads, paths, gates, and borders. The system depends on fast sharing of information, a description, a direction, a person seen running, a stranger who does not belong. It also turns public presence into pressure. People are compelled to respond, not just morally, but often legally. Community members become part of enforcement. In this model, investigation is not mainly slow and private. It is quick and public. The goal is to catch a person before they blend back into normal life. Watch and ward, time, routine, and the control of nighttime. Visibility is always weaker at night. In many societies, night was linked to theft, violence, and fear, not because night creates crime, but because night hides identity. To respond to this, towns developed systems of watch and ward. The details differed by place and period, but the general goal was similar: organize people to guard gates, patrol streets, and challenge strangers after dark. Night watch systems worked by making nighttime movement more visible and more risky. If you were out late without a clear reason, you might be questioned or detained until morning. The point was not only to catch criminals, the point was to limit the freedom that darkness gives to anyone who wants to act unseen. This shows an important principle: order is easier to keep when movement follows expected patterns. When everyone knows that normal people are home at night, anyone outside becomes easier to notice. The night watch also created a simple kind of street-level investigation. A watchman could observe who is drunk, who is fighting, who is breaking curfew rules, who is carrying weapons, who is trying doors, who is lurking. These are basic observations, but they matter in a world without cameras, radios, or forensic labs. They are the early tools of policing, presence, recognition, questioning, and reporting. Markets, fairs, and public spaces as enforcement zones. In many pre-modern societies, markets and fairs were major public gatherings. Trade brought strangers. Strangers brought opportunity, but also risk. Authorities often treated these events as places needing extra control, not always through permanent forces, but through temporary rules, visible officials, and clear enforcement points. Public space helps enforcement in several ways. First, it increases witnesses. If a theft occurs in a crowded market, someone may recognize the thief, the victim, or the stolen item. Second, it increases the chance of immediate response. A disturbance can be confronted quickly. Third, it supports public punishment or public shaming measures, which rely on being seen by others. Public punishments were not only about harming the offender. Many were about displaying consequences. Stocks, pillories, public whipping, and other visible penalties were designed to connect wrongdoing with a public mark. This approach treats the community itself as part of the punishment system. The offender is not only disciplined by officials. The offender is exposed to the judgment of neighbors. This method has obvious dangers and unfairness. It can be abused, and it can punish reputations beyond what a court might intend. But as a system, it shows how strongly many societies relied on the power of being seen. Cities and the problem of anonymity. As towns and cities grew, older methods based on close personal recognition became less reliable. In a large city, A person can move through crowds without being known. This created a major challenge: anonymity. When anonymity rises, visibility must be rebuilt in new ways. This often happens through organization, patrols, records, and regulated spaces. We can see early forms of this in large ancient and early modern cities. Authorities tried to make urban life legible, meaning easier to read and control. They did this by setting boundaries, monitoring gates, regulating night movement, and appointing officials responsible for particular districts. Urban order also depended on workplaces, inns, and landlords. If a city requires that strangers lodge only in certain places, the city gains control points. The innkeeper becomes a source of information, landlords become responsible for tenants, neighborhood leaders become intermediaries. In this way, private people are pulled into public order systems. The state does not need a large police force if it can require others to report, register, or take responsibility. Ancient Athens, public order with limited police capacity. Classical Athens is often described as having a limited form of policing compared to modern systems. One known feature is the use of publicly owned slaves associated with keeping order in certain public settings. The key point for visibility is that Athens depended heavily on public life. Politics happened openly, courts were public, meetings were gatherings. This creates a culture where behavior is visible to many people at once. In such a setting, social pressure can be strong. A person's standing depends on how they are seen by others. But it also creates risks. Crowds can become disorderly. So Athens used organized personnel to keep order in assemblies and public places. Even when the state had some force available, it still relied heavily on the public nature of civic life, accusation, testimony, and reputation. Many legal processes were driven by citizens bringing complaints and presenting arguments, rather than by state investigators building cases in private. Again, the system depends on what can be seen and said publicly. Ancient Rome, night patrols and informers. Rome grew into a massive city by ancient standards. With size came congestion, fire risk, theft, and street violence. Rome developed organized night patrol and fire response forces, such as the Vigiles. These forces had roles connected to nighttime order, not only firefighting. They patrolled, watched for trouble, and could detain suspects. This is another example of visibility as control. Lantern-lit patrols create a moving eye in the streets. They reduce the cover of darkness. Rome also illustrates another kind of visibility, the informer. In a system without a modern police force or a modern public prosecutor in the way we think of it today, informers and private accusers could play a major role. In Roman imperial contexts, informers, sometimes called delatores, could bring information and accusations, sometimes with rewards. This creates a different kind of order through visibility. Citizens watch each other because reporting can bring benefits or protection. The results can be a society where people are cautious about what they say and do, not only because guards might see them, but because someone around them might report them. This system can maintain order, but it can also create fear, false accusations, and political abuse. Still, it is part of the long history of using observation and reporting to substitute for a large uniformed police presence. The logic of visible authority. When authorities lack constant manpower, they often try to make authority visible in concentrated moments. This can include patrols at key times, inspections, or public ceremonies. It can include officials positioned at gates, bridges, and markets. It can include courts held in central places. A single official cannot watch everything. But if people repeatedly see enforcement happen, they begin to expect it. This expectation is a major part of how visibility reinforces order. The goal is not perfect observation. The goal is to shape behavior through the belief that observation is possible. the difference between being watched and feeling watchable. A major shift in thinking about visibility and power is often explained through the idea of the panopticon, a prison design associated with Jeremy Bentham and later analyzed by the philosopher Michel Foucault. The design's basic concept is simple. A central observer can potentially see many inmates, while inmates cannot easily know when they are being watched. The uncertainty becomes the control. This idea matters beyond prisons because it describes a broader logic. People may regulate themselves when they know they could be observed. In older systems, control often depended on real witnesses, neighbors, watchmen, market crowds. In the panopticon logic, control depends on the possibility of observation built into the environment. The environment does part of the work. Walls, windows, lighting, and layout create a constant sense that behavior is exposed. Even if observation is not continuous, its effect can be, from public punishment to enclosed discipline. Many early punishment systems were public. Executions, whippings, and humiliations were displayed. The message was meant for everyone. Over time, many societies moved punishment into more controlled, enclosed spaces, prisons, workhouses, and institutions. This may sound like punishment became less visible. In some ways, it did. But within institutions, punishment and discipline could become more intensely organized around visibility. Instead of a crowd watching a sentence once, supervisors could watch daily routines. Instead of a public spectacle, there could be schedules, inspections, records, and constant monitoring of conduct. This is a different kind of visibility. It is less about the public witnessing punishment and more about authorities witnessing behavior. Investigation before modern detectives, visibility as evidence. Before modern forensic science, evidence often came from human observation. That meant the basic building blocks of investigation were: who saw the act? Who heard the argument? Who saw the suspect nearby? Who recognized the stolen goods? Who can identify handwriting or a seal? Who can vouch for a person's character? In many courts, character evidence mattered because it helped solve a practical problem. When facts are uncertain, known reputation becomes a guide. This is not the same as modern standards of proof, and it could be unfair. But in a world with limited physical evidence, societies used social knowledge as a form of information. Visibility also mattered for property. Stolen goods were easier to hide if goods were common and unmarked. Communities tried to reduce this by encouraging public selling in markets, using witnesses for major transactions, and treating suspicious private sales as signs of theft. Public buying and selling makes ownership more visible. It creates witnesses who can later say, "I saw him sell it," or "I saw her buy it." Records, making behavior visible over time. Written records expanded the reach of authority. A record can preserve information beyond the moment of observation. It can connect a person's name to taxes, property, debts, arrests, or punishments. As record-keeping grew, it supported new ways of controlling movement and identity. Lists of residents or households make membership visible. Court rolls record disputes and penalties. Registers of fines and obligations make non-payment visible. Licenses and permits make certain activities visible. When officials can consult records, a person cannot rely only on present appearances. Past behavior becomes part of how they are treated. In this way, visibility becomes cumulative. A person's history follows them. This matters for policing because repeated small records can turn into a profile: a known troublemaker, a repeat offender, a disorderly in. Even without modern databases, older states built systems where information accumulated in offices, courts, or local administrations. Street design and the control of movement. Visibility is also shaped by physical design. Wide roads allow patrols and witnesses. Narrow alleys hide offenders. Open squares support gatherings and enforcement. Walls and gates create checkpoints. Lighting changes what can be seen. Some historical laws even required changes to the environment to reduce hiding places and make travel safer. When authorities focus on roads, bridges, markets, and gates, they are focusing on the points where people must pass. Control is easier at choke points. This is another recurring pattern. When you cannot watch everywhere, you watch where movement concentrates. Community officials as eyes and ears. Before modern police, many roles combined local authority with observation. Constables, beadles, watchmen, and other local officers were often not full-time professionals in earlier periods. Some were appointed from the community, some were paid, some served temporarily. Their power often relied on local knowledge. They knew who belonged. They knew who had a history of trouble. They knew where stolen goods might be hidden. They knew who was likely to fight after drinking. This is practical visibility, not just seeing an act, but seeing patterns. However, this also meant enforcement could be uneven. Local officers might be biased. They might protect friends. They might target outsiders. Visibility can support order, but it can also support unfair control. Still, as a system, local officers show how much older policing depended on personal recognition rather than technical evidence. Why visibility changes behavior. Visibility affects behavior for several reasons. First, it raises the risk of being identified. If you think you will be recognized, you may avoid wrongdoing. Second, it raises the risk of immediate intervention. If others are present, an act may be stopped. Third, it raises the risk of later testimony. Witnesses can speak in court. Fourth, it raises the risk of reputation damage. Even if there is no trial, being seen can harm social standing. Fifth, it supports collective enforcement. Communities can act together when information is shared quickly. These effects are strongest when three conditions exist. 1. People know each other or can identify strangers. 2. There are shared norms about what behavior is unacceptable. 3. There are real consequences, formal or informal, that follow being seen. If any of these conditions weaken, visibility has less power. When visibility fails, visibility is not always enough to keep order. In crowded cities, recognition breaks down. In times of war, famine, or mass movement, strangers become common. In corrupt systems, being seen does not lead to fair enforcement. In unequal societies, some people are watched more than others. Also, criminals adapt. They learn to exploit darkness, disguise, crowded places, and confusion. When criminals adapt, societies respond by changing patrol patterns, increasing lighting, strengthening gate controls, and expanding record keeping. This back and forth is a long historical pattern. Visibility is never complete. It is a tool that must be maintained. Order through visibility as a pre-modern strategy. Across historical periods, visibility helped replace what modern people often assume is necessary: a large, trained, centrally organized police force with fast communication and specialized investigators. Instead, many older systems used community responsibility, so membership could not be ignored; public alarms and pursuit, so suspects could not easily escape unseen; night watches and curfews, so darkness offered less freedom; public spaces and public punishments, so consequences were displayed; local officers, so enforcement relied on recognition and routine patrol; informers and accusers, so private observation fed into public authority; records, so behavior became visible across time. In each case, the same basic logic appears. If people believe they can be observed, identified, and connected to consequences, many will regulate their own behavior. In this sense, visibility is not only a method of catching wrongdoers, it is a method of shaping everyday choices. The historical lesson is not that older societies were always orderly, or that visibility always produced justice. The lesson is that when formal policing is limited, societies often build order by making life watchable. They do it through eyes in the street, through neighbors and officials, through shared responsibility, through gates and patrols, and through records that keep the memory of behavior alive. Order through visibility is therefore not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest tools of social control, used in different forms across villages, towns, empires, and institutions. And, long before cameras or digital tracking, the simple fact of being seen remained one of the strongest forces shaping how people acted in daily life.